Hello and welcome to Code with JV. Today I'll be talking about how we can create and modify learning plans, as well as how I would learn to code if I was starting from scratch using ChatGPT as a tutor. Let's jump into it. In the last video, I demonstrated this AI tutor prompt. Link is in the description. It's up on GitHub. You can click on the init.md, and this gives you the human readable version of the prompt. If you click raw, then it gives you the markdown version. You can Control-A, copy, drop it into a ChatGPT session, then you've primed ChatGPT to act like a tutor. It's not specifically configured to be a coding tutor, but that's the main use case I've been testing it for. If you want to create a new learning plan from scratch, you can check out the previous video, but the gist of it is you give it the context. This is some bit about my background. This is what my long-term goals are. This is my previous experience. What are your objectives? This is something I'd like to be able to do. And what's the task you'd like to give it? Please teach me JavaScript or programming or APIs or React and user interfaces or whatever it is you want to do. Today, I've gone and made a new repo called Learning Plan Starters, and here I've got two sample learning plans. They're both courses for how to learn the fundamentals of programming. One's in JavaScript and one's in Python. For most of the students I'm talking to, JavaScript and Python are really good choices for the projects they want to build. They're both quite accessible, very good entry-level programming languages. But mostly I think it's about how do you learn the fundamentals of coding, because once you get them locked in, you can switch languages pretty easy, especially when you're using ChatGPT to help you. So I've made two sample learning plans here. They're designed to be starters, which you extend and add your own flavor to. If we look at the JavaScript one, it's got a bunch of modules in it. If you've ever looked at Introduction to Programming curriculum, it's pretty standard. Variables and data types, ifs and loops, functions, declaring them, calling them, using objects, and a project building a simple guessing game. You can click into each one. Say we go into the variables and data types. It will have a bunch of activities, and then it will have a bunch of practice exercises, as well as some extra resources. This is all built using the AI tutor to give you a starting point if you just want to jump in and start using these. Now, if I was going to extend these, for example, let's look at the Python one. It's the same thing, but let's click on the raw. This is getting me the underlying markdown code. Let's say I'd like to learn a bit more about Markdown. So I'll give it a prompt. I have this Python course, I want to adjust it. Please add a module about learning Markdown at the beginning. And if we run that, here you'll see the module 1. Oh look, Markdown basics, then the variable data types, etc. It's gone and added an extra module in the beginning. You can start to customize it. For example, if you wanted to go into a bit more depth about the terminal or learning about Visual Studio or Python setup, you could ask it to go into more depth at those stages for you. I think it's really useful when you're building your learning plans to ask yourself, how much coding do you want to do over the next year or so? If you're thinking it might be 50 or 100 hours, like 1 or 2 hours a week on average, then you'd probably have a very different learning plan than if you said it was going to be 500 hours or 1,000 hours or 1,500 hours of coding. If you're going to do a lot of coding in the future, my advice would be to go a lot slower and to focus on your fundamentals and really dialing them in. Then you can start to have less waste as you're doing lots of coding. Whereas if you're going to be coding a little bit over the next year, I'd suggest to be very tactical with your learning and learn only what you need to get your projects done, because you don't have that much time to spend. I would suggest that you start to really focus on how to read code and how to modify code. You can get ChatGPT to create some things for you, then you understand them and change them. Whereas if you're going to be writing tons of code, I'd suggest you really want to be doing a lot more actual writing code from scratch, which is a much harder skill to master. It takes a lot more time to be comfortable to do that. I'll show you a little bit about that in the demo. Here I've added a module. The project I want to do is I want to use the benchmark email, which is what I'm using for my email list, and I want to be able to interact with the API. Please add a module at the end to teach me about APIs and using a particular API I'm interested in. Here we've got the Markdown basics, the variables. Now it's adding some introduction to APIs. If we started to do things like make a module plan or module 7. Whenever I'm setting up curriculum, often I like to test it. And I just like to see, is it giving me the right thing? So fundamentals of APIs, using the benchmark API, sending emails, managing email campaigns. As part of Code with JV, I send out a weekly newsletter to people. It's using this particular email system. I can start to learn about its API. When you're building APIs, often you're leaning on the documentation quite a lot. This is where ChatGPT can actually save you a ton of time. If you can start to do simple API tasks without having to read and parse quite complex websites. This is how I'm customizing it. So that looks good to me. Save my course plan as a code block. Course, Introduction to Python. It seems to have saved that correctly. And it's got my API module in there. Please save module 7 as a code block. This is where I'd get one of those module plans. It's spitting out those APIs. So what I'd suggest doing is take these vanilla learning plans and then start to add in the flavors. If you're feeling like it's a bit too much to get started, add in more depth at the beginning. Go a bit slower as you get your foundations under you. If you want particular things, bake it into your course plan, and then you're good to go. At any stage, I can go and copy the course plan, or I can copy the code for the module plan, add it to wherever I'm saving my learning plans, and then when I want to learn a particular thing, I can reinstantiate the tutor, paste in the tutor prompt, paste in the thing I want to learn, teach me X, Y, and Z, make practice exercises for me, start to work through it in a tutorial. It's useful to talk about different types of curriculum. If you think about tutorials as one type, which is often when you go to ChatGPT and say, teach me activity X, it will start to build what I would call a tutorial. It's a bunch of texts that give you an example about how to do something, and it's got some theory behind it, it's got some demonstrations of the practical things, and it's giving you an exposure to the knowledge you need to be able to do that thing. Coupled with that is often practice exercises. So if you've ever got ChatGPT building your curriculum and it doesn't have practice exercises, I'd really encourage you to put some in there. Say, make me 3 practice exercises for this material. And then you'll start to have things which really help you practice and embed that knowledge. Because when you read a tutorial and you see some things, and then you have a learning exercise afterwards, which you get to practice just the stuff you've seen, excellent way to pursue it. Additionally to that, I would say there's this idea of projects. If a practice exercise is the teacher or the tutor gives you the exercise to build, a project is where you have the thing you want to build. And so having the exercises close to what you want your projects to be is a really good way to progress your learning. Do the tutorial, do some practice exercises, build your project. That's a very thorough way of going. If you're trying to be very efficient or tactical with your learning, maybe you don't want to do as many practice exercises. Maybe you want to go straight to your projects. Let's jump into like how I'd learn to code using this approach. If I start at the very beginning, I've already got the Python one in here. Teach me module 1. Install Visual Studio Code, basic terminal commands, and your package management system. Different languages have different package management systems, and Python has a bunch. I suggested Conda in this one, and you can research about alternatives if you want to, but it's a decent one to start with. You need a text editor, Visual Studio Code. You need to know a little bit about terminal commands. ChatGPT is pretty good at teaching this stuff. If you start with Teach Me Activity 1, it will start to talk you through downloading, installing, launching, exploring. For example, it's starting to say, let's add some extensions for Python. Exactly what I would be teaching you if I was starting to say, hey, let's get Visual Studio Code set up so you can code some Python. If you get stuck at any step of the way, you can say, hey, ChatGPT, help me out. It can be a little bit tricky to get this up and running for the first time if you're not familiar with it, but just take your time, ask ChatGPT for any questions, and if you really get stuck, then try and find someone who knows what they're doing to help you out. And likewise, you can start going, okay, teach me. Often I find if I'm using ChatGPT to walk through things and I'm going, okay, activity 1, activity 2, it can just start to drift. It can start to forget. That's why it's so important to have your learning plan saved, because then you can just paste it back in and say, hey, look, this is what my module looks like. Let's go back to where we are. One of the dangerous things about a tutorial or reading information is that when you watch videos or read tutorials and it's passive learning, you can have a false sense of competency because you can read it and you go, oh, I understand that. That makes sense to me. It doesn't mean when you're sitting down in front of a terminal or a blank screen that you can actually make it work. So it's when you start to practice it that you really get it locked in. But the first stage is start to read it, start to understand it. What I would suggest aiming at for module 1 is, can you get a simple hello world running in VS Code? Because it already knows that we're in Python, it will probably just create it in the right way. We can make this, we can copy the code. If you've got everything set up, you should be able to make a new file. Let's call it hello.py. So py is the extension which says this is a Python file. Paste in the code. Then like many programmers before us, Python, and we run the file name. If it says hello world, you've got Python installed. If you can get up to this level, you've probably got module 1 complete. If we look at these other modules, variables and data types, control structures, each one of them, it's got quite a bit of stuff in it. If you want to be very thorough, you can go through each activity, teach me activity 1, give me practice exercises for it, just go through very slowly, thoroughly, and you're building up a very solid foundation. Complete the exercises mostly by writing the code yourself rather than asking ChatGPT to generate it. That is the slow and thorough way to go through this, which if you want to do a lot of programming, I'd suggest going slower. If you want to do a little bit of programming, I'd suggest going a bit faster. Just skim these, go through them and do a teach me, but go through it quite quickly. And then I would jump into the practice exercise. Let's load this one up. I'm jumping into the Markdown. Teach me module 2. Here you'll start to see the activities listed out. I would just do a quick teach me the activities, and then I would jump into Okay, please create a sample solution for me. Here, it's making some code. If we copy it, let's call this area.py. If you're going through the course rapidly, I would suggest you want to get familiar with reading code and you want to get familiar with changing code. This is a small solution. There's not much code here. You can start to look at this. Can you run it? Does it make sense to you? If so, okay, you can move on to the next thing. If I was wanting to learn code slowly and thoroughly, I would suggest starting with blank pages for things like this. How can you use Python to calculate the area of a rectangle? You need to think about what your inputs are. What data do you need to do this computation? You need to know the dimensions of your rectangle. You need to know your algorithm. What's the algorithm for creating an area, etc. And you'd need to have some user input. Okay, how do I say what it is? Then you could start to test it where you run it. Okay, looks like it's in the right direction. Maybe there's a UI error here. And again, this can take a lot of practice. It's quite hard to go from reading a tutorial and then from a blank page using that, and you'd probably forget lots of things about how to do different operators or what your functions are called, etc. So two different approaches depending on how thorough you'd like to be or how quick you'd like to go through the material. Often I find it's useful to look at the human readable version of the curriculum just to remind myself of where am I and what am I looking at, etc. If you're going through quickly, the thing I would suggest aiming at would be, let's do this guessing game. If you look at this, raw So please create a sample solution for module 6, paste in the module. You'll see there's a fair bit more code here. You can copy it, you can run it, but then you can start to ask ChatGPT questions like, I don't really understand this while loop. Please explain this code to me. How does this conditional work? You can start to look at things like max attempts and attempts. How does this work? If you want to learn how to code quickly, I would suggest you want to get to the stage where you're confident having ChatGPT create scripts for you. Then you can start to interrogate those scripts, look at them, ask yourself, are you confident to run this? Go through this material, start to get your head around variables, loops, conditionals, the core foundations of programming, functions, how to call functions, return values, how to pass information to functions. All this stuff, if you don't understand it, code will always be a black box and you won't be able to confidently read it and go, yes, I know what this code is doing. Now we're starting to get into the terrain of, hey, the course is finished, so we're getting into the extra modules you've created. I think having scripts which hit APIs so you can pull data from one system and send data to another one, this is where ChatGPT is excellent. You don't have to learn a whole bunch of HTML and JavaScript and how to build rich interfaces or anything about mobile development. It's just a script, it runs in your terminal, and it talks to the systems. The thing to be aware of is that if you're ever starting to change data in these systems, you can actually cause damage. If I get into my email list API and I start deleting emails, they'll be gone and that won't be good news. You start to need to be confident in knowing what your code will do when you start to talk to APIs. But if you're just reading data from APIs, it's pretty safe to play around. Let's talk to the GitHub API. For example, if you go to GitHub API, you can also ask ChatGPT, and if it's an old API, as in older than a couple of years, it'll probably know where it is, especially if it's a big popular system. But this is where, if you were to sit down and say, I want to learn how to do the GitHub API, there's a lot of reading here. If you look at the resources, the API versions, there's a whole bunch of things you can read about actions, and it's like there's just a ton of material. But ChatGPT has read all of this and it understands it. And if you ask it to do tasks with this API, it will suggest code, which is pretty good. This is where I think it's just unlocks so much potential as you're learning programming. So in GitHub, if we go back to a GitHub page, you've got this concept of repositories. So Code with JV is an organization and it has 2 repositories in it. You can start to read and write to the API. So give me a script which lists all the repos in the Code with JV org. Not too much code. Again, here's the organization, here's the URL it's hitting. It's read the docs and it understands that. We can copy that. Let's make a new script and let's call it github.py. And here I'm going to clear in my terminal, Python GitHub. You'll see it's listing out those two repos there. They're all the names of them. With APIs, if I go and turn off my internet, let's just go and turn the Wi-Fi off. If I run this code again, a whole bunch of errors. Whenever you're coding and you get a bunch of errors, you can just copy a bunch from your terminal, jump back to ChatGPT, and oh, no internet. Okay, let's fix that bit. Oh, you know that if you press spacebar, you can get the dinosaur game? No, internet's back. Don't get to play dinosaur game. You can just paste the error message in. And this is where ChatGPT is usually pretty good. It looks like this is something to do with your internet connectivity. It's given me the correct suggestion here. And so I've written a simple script talking to the GitHub API. You can start to change it. For example, if I was sitting here saying, I want to change a script, I don't want to print out the names to the repos, I want the URLs so I can click on them and actually get to the page. This is where it would actually take a fair bit of debugging to do. I'd have to read the GitHub API docs to know what's the right thing to put inside of this string. How do I get not the name but the actual URL from it? What's that word? You'd have to read the documentation. You can start to do things like this. Okay, print repo. Then if I run my code, I'm just printing out the whole object that we're getting back, and it's got all this data, and it takes a bit of work to figure that out. Or you can just jump back to ChatGPT, tell it what you want to do. Please print out the URL as well as the name. And here, okay, it is generating code. Oh, HTML_URL. That's the right thing to paste in there. Copy it, paste it in, and here we've got the new one with the HTML URL. Run it again, and here I'm getting the name as well as the URL. And you can start to format it the way you want, etc. If I'm writing scripts, usually I'm asking ChatGPT to do stuff like that instead of manually figuring out how to change things. It's really effective at doing it. So hopefully that's enough to get you started. Pull down one of the learning plans. If you're not interested in Python or JavaScript, talk to ChatGPT, figure out what it is that you do want to learn, convert or create some curriculum for it. I'd suggest get your fundamentals of coding dialed in so you can understand variables and functions and objects and just reading the code and making sense of it, because as soon as you start building interesting projects, you're going to need to understand what the code is before you run it, because if it does something you don't want it to do, it could actually delete data in APIs, etc. In my first job, I sent my boss like 86,000 emails by doing an infinite loop on a test server. It was a learning about know what the code does before you run it. As you start to build more interesting programs, the consequences of the code not doing what you want become more significant. I would really focus on just make sure you understand what the code is, and then lean on ChatGPT to write it and to change it, and you'll start to be able to produce some things which will hopefully save you some time and give you a quick ROI on your learning. Anyway, that's it for today. Let me know what sort of videos you want more of. If you're a subscriber to this channel or you're on my newsletter, let me know what sort of videos you want. I'm really happy to make videos on pretty much any topic. I've got lots of ideas, but hey, put it in the comments, reply to my emails, just let me know. Really happy to start taking suggestions as we go on this journey together. Take care. Happy learning.